Sir Desmond Stirling, in The Tell-Tale Nipple, Episode 3. This was ludicrous. It had been less than 30 seconds and no one else was in the room. I flopped back into the rocking chair in a puzzled huff. I stared at the portrait. I could swear the bugger was smirking at me. This was going to be a prolonged enough night, without whisky deprivation to boot. I decided to examine the room thoroughly, to see if there were any possible secret entrances. Wouldn't be the first time a priest's hole had been the answer to a few questions. I tapped walls, lifted a rug, which disintegrated into a cloud of rancid dust, and even peered under the bed, a fossilized mouse and a chipped egg grallen. I examined the fireplace, lest the blocking off wasn't quite so thorough. But it would require a mallet and a brace of navvies to get through that. I admit, I was stumped. I shivered. The temperature in the box room had definitely dropped. As a consequence, I felt a twitch in my bladder, and became aware that I would imminently have to thrust Thomas at the Twyfords. But I worried that if I left the room, I would be reluctant to return. Perhaps I would have to use the gazunder I'd just found. My blood ran cold. The portrait was most definitely staring at me. The eyes were blazing with light, malignancy burning from them as they gleamed wickedly at me. I gasped and rubbed my eyes. When I looked again, the eyes were normal, cruel and piercing still, but not aflame as before. I had to admit that something fishy was afoot. Either I was experiencing genuine paranormal activity, or someone was arsing about, and if I found out who, they'd be in for a severe hiding. "Give me back my bloody booze, you rotten spook!" I suddenly erupted. Oh, to hell with it. I was going downstairs to get myself a bottle of something. Abaddon's prides itself that alcohol, a bed, and a scrubber are never knowingly unavailable. As I reached the door, there was a chuckle. I whirled round. I definitely heard that. It was a laugh. A man's laugh, but not a good-natured one. It was a joyless, sarcastic sound. But where had it come from? "Was that you?" I asked the portrait, my hand still on the doorknob. There was an eerie glow emanating from the portrait. I rubbed my eyes. Standing in front of the portrait of what I assumed was Sir Desmond Stirling was the man himself. It was as though the painting had come alive and stepped out from the frame. Listener, I am man enough to admit that only the staunchest clenching of my buttocks prevented me from being involuntarily at stool. While the logical circuits of my brain were computing the various rational likelihoods of what I was seeing, my instincts were screaming, "Ghost! Run!" I knew that I should be snapping away with my camera, but it was on the other side of the room, requiring me to actually get nearer the fiendish apparition. I gulped and tried to pull myself together. "Can I help you?" I asked the manifestation, my voice at least a higher octave than listeners of my occasional spots on the moral maze would recognize. The ghost smiled the ghastliest of smiles, and crooked its finger, gesturing for me to approach. I sensibly stayed where I was, or thought I did. My legs had other ideas, and despite my best efforts, they forced me, step by step, into the arms of the ghost. The phantom's chilly embrace overwhelmed me. My head swam. I feared I was going to lose consciousness. And then I found myself somewhere else. It was a large drawing room, A dark, thundery sky outside, the room lit by a roaring fire in the hearth. Two men were arguing. An old cove in fancy dress, 18th century, I thought, was wagging his finger at the other man, whom I recognized as the living manifestation of the ghost. This must be the living Jasper de Scornley and his father. The older man, the Earl of Greenford, was a feeble beast, spindly of leg, a moth-eaten wig perched precariously on his chinless head, a blanket round his weedy shoulders. He was chastising his son with a distinct lack of authority. Sir Jasper towered over his ineffectual father, contempt emanating off him. If he were my son, a clip round the ear would be the least he would get, but the Earl would have needed a step-ladder just to reach his son's ear. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I presumed that the Earl was trying to persuade his son to behave less like an ass and more like the son of an aristocrat. Not that in my experience there's that much of a chasm between the two. Jasper threw back his head and laughed at his father, his hands on his hips. They did actually do that in the olden days, I marvelled. It wasn't just something invented by Douglas Fairbanks. It was a practice I resolved to adopt myself, particularly the next time the quack urges me to cut down on the drink. I have no idea what the Earl said next, but Jasper suddenly whipped his sword out and held the tip to his father's throat. The Earl's knees actually knocked, and his lip trembled. Jasper abruptly sheathed his sword and swept from the room, curses obviously falling silently from his mouth. I was no longer in the drawing-room. I was witness to a rapid barrage of different scenes of Jasper up to no good, gambling, whoring, fighting duels, knocking back the grog in divers taverns, indeed having a splendid time which I rather envied. Then things turned darker. Occult rituals in the dank crypt, naked lasses tied to altars, chickens getting their throats cut, a tubby man having the blood of the poor deceased bird rubbed into his corpulent frame. By the rapt way his fellow Satanists fawned on him, I rather suspected he might be royalty. This was confirmed when the crypt was raided by soldiers, and the chubby man was deferred to, while all the other participants were manhandled somewhat roughly. Then suddenly we were in the box room, yes, this very room in which I was spending the night, where Jasper was greeted by a young woman in servant's garb. For the first time, Jasper showed a tenderness as he kissed and embraced the young maid, followed by such a right royal rogering that even I felt I ought to avert my eyes, which I resisted, as I considered it my duty to watch all the phantom was showing me. Before I'd had time to catch my breath, or indeed rearrange my underpants, we were swept to a bleak graveyard, where a funeral was taking place. A coffin was lowered into an open grave, while a vicar soundlessly intoned prayers. A group of mourners each flung a sod of earth onto the coffin, but then Sir Jasper appeared, striding determinedly towards the grave. Several mourners, his brothers, I wondered, produced their swords and chased him away. Jasper shook his fist at the men and leapt onto his waiting horse. Next, we were at a dockside beside a rough grey sea. Jasper, bound and gagged, is pushed at sword point up the gangplank by the same men from the graveyard. They watch until the ship has sailed, only leaving when the ship has finally reached the horizon. After they leave, only one person is left at the dockside, watching the diminishing ship. It is the maid from earlier, her cheeks stained with tears. She is very palpably up the duff. Following this, we see, quite unnecessarily I thought, the maid in childbirth, which was quite gruesome, all blood and guts and slime, not what any fellow should be forced to witness. The result was a baby boy. Sadly, I don't think the mother survived the ordeal. The child grew swiftly in front of my eyes, time speeding faster and faster as I watched him spawn a son himself, who in turn spawned another boy, and so on, and so on. The acceleration of the visions became too much for me, and I was overwhelmed with dizziness. I roared, pleaded for it to stop. And the next thing I knew, I was lying on the bed back in the box room, the very bed on which I had recently observed the maid giving birth so disgustingly. I sat up and shook my head. How long had all that taken? It felt like I had watched those centuries pass in real time. I glanced at my watch. 3:57 a.m. Was it still the same night? A hand passed me my hip flask. "Thank you," I said automatically. But just as I was about to swig, I froze. I glanced up. The ghost of Sir Jasper de Scornley was standing in front of me. The spectre of Sir Jasper de Scornley stared at me, his fiery eyes burning deep into my soul. He looked as solid as flesh, but I suspected that if I touched him, he would evaporate, like steam from a kettle, so I kept my hands to myself. "Hello," I said feebly. "Jolly interesting life you had." Hardly Wildian, but the etiquette for addressing a ghost evaded me. A hint of a sneer crossed Sir Jasper's face, but I suspected that this was his default expression. "Verily, my life was stolen from me, as indeed was my inheritance." He whipped out his sword from his scabbard. I ducked, but he pointed it at the window. 5,000 leagues west of here, my bones lay rotting neath the solitary tree. The feeble cross mark in the grave has many years hence been the shit of the woodworm. "Shame," I commiserated. "Still, you packed a lot of hijinks in your life, short as it may have been. I haven't seen so much debauchery, I considered, well, for months." I hadn't even finished before Sir Jasper had the point of his sword pressing into my neck, just to the right of my Adam's apple. "What is life for, except for indulging the flesh and the pleasure it craves?" "Quite," I agreed. The point of the sword was sliding down my front, popping buttons on my shirt. I was relieved it was just a British Home Store shirt, not a bespoke one from Monsieur Herring of Mayfair. My life was curtailed, while there was still so much bodily gratification to explore. The spook brushed his free hand against what I hoped was his codpiece. "That's a shame." I wasn't quite sure what he expected me to do about it. It wasn't as though he still had a body to gratify, not a corporeal one anyway. I could point him in the direction of Dolores of Frith Street, but even she would balk at pleasuring a randy wraith, and she'll usually do anything as long as one has washed one's Johnson first. "I demand only one appeasement, the restoration of my bloodline, and the rightful ennoblement of the most recent of the spawn of my spawn." Yes, I'd expected it might be something like that. Why else show me the procession of descendants of the little bastard who was born in this very room? "Oh, genealogy isn't my strong point, oh darling," I replied, rummaging through dusty ledgers and birth certificates and what-not. "Leave that to the librarians and other weeds. Making stuff up is more my forte." A smirk passed across the phantasm's face. "There is a simple way of identifying a true de Scornley." And with that, he thrust open his garments and exposed himself to me. I gasped. "You have 3, I exclaimed. "In all my days as a nudist, I've never seen that before." De Scornley sneered. "The 3rd nipple has been passed down from de Scornley to de Scornley from time immemorial. Even my feeble father and my scurvy brothers possessed the sacred blemish." "Yes, well," I began, "unique as it may be, and devoted nudist that I am, I can't very well go asking random chaps to show me their chests. I'm not Dickie Wattis." The ghost's eyes narrowed. "And besides," I hastily continued, "even if the nudist camps were allowed to open it, it's still winter, however hardy the de Scornleys may be." The wretched phantom emitted an unearthly shriek. "Find me progeny, or I shall haunt you until the end of time, Sir Desmond Stirling." He pointed a bony finger at me. I noticed his fingernail was filthy, and wondered if it was from scrabbling at the coffin lid. I shrugged. I wasn't going to give this spectral oik the satisfaction of intimidating me. I'll do my best, I mean. I pointed at the window. "Look, dawn is imminent, and I need my beauty sleep, and surely you need to return to your grave." Sir Jasper glanced at the flecks of light which were breaking up the night. "Return here when you have found the issue. I will be waiting for you." At this, the candles blew out, and the room was plunged into darkness. I hastily relit the nearest candle. Sir Jasper was gone. I had lied to the spook. Sleep was the last thing on my mind, and besides, I had no intention of spending another minute in that ghastly little room. I raced down the stairs, left the club, ignoring the puzzled look of the night porter, and searched for a taxi. Within minutes, I had flagged one down and instructed the driver to hotfoot me to Hampstead. My son-in-law, Darren Frognall, self-styled mousy tongue of the macabre, was not best pleased to be woken at what he considered an ungodly hour. Frankly, if he were in the army, this would be almost time for elevenses. He stared at me in his improbably short dressing-gown, which revealed unsurprisingly skinny legs and a shamefully hairless chest. But he soon saw that I had important intel to impart, so he led me into the kitchen and fired up the coffee percolator. He offered me toast, too, and then demonstrated a remarkable machine, unimaginably called a toaster, which actually toasts bread. I haven't made any toast myself since school days, when we held the bread on forks in front of the roaring fire prepared earlier by our fag. And if the fire wasn't roaring, said fag wouldn't be able to sit down for a week. Or in the case of Snotty Gove's pater, unable to stand. Eventually, we were sitting down at the kitchen table with our coffee and freshly buttered toast, and I related my adventures of the previous night. Frognall listened keenly, with the surprisingly good sense not to interrupt a master storyteller at work. I had reached the point when Sir Jasper had revealed the presence of his descendants. A strange look crossed Frognall's face, and he leant forward, causing his dressing-gown to fall open, revealing, just to the right of the centre of his pitiful chest, the presence of a third nipple. Sir Desmond Stirling, in The Tell-Tale Nipple, was written and performed by Anthony Keetch.